to the Milken Conference. One of the great things about this conference is that we get some of the greatest, in my view, national leaders, people who had many, many choices, and they decided to spend their time serving all of us. It's a great privilege to be here. In 1969, when Mike Milken gave his first speech, he's entitled, "The Best Investors Are Social Scientists." And I can't think of a better opportunity to spend some time understanding the, shall we say, the non-engineering, the non-analytical part of the world that our governors who've served us so well over the years have done. What I wanted to do is I wanted to start by introducing them briefly. I think everybody knows roughly Rick Scott, who's over here, Governor of Florida. He was a hospital entrepreneur, founder of a hospital's venture capitalist. He's in his second term, and he is, by the way, a Trump supporter. He is here from Florida. Scott Walker, governor of Wisconsin, second term, also, by the way, a Cruz supporter. His background was in local government and a significant local government management, and ultimately ran for a whole bunch of things and became governor, as you know. John Hickenlooper, the governor of Colorado, is in his second term, a Clinton supporter, and his path was very interesting. He started as a geologist, which I think benefits or comes with Colorado, wandered the space of businesses in Colorado and became the mayor of Denver, and from there became governor. He's in his second term. He's also recently married. Happy for him.
Happily.
If it's recent, it should also be happy.
That's not always the case.
Recently and happily married as of, I believe, January, Governor.
Said the same thought.
And Governor McAuliffe from Virginia is in his first term. He was the chairman of the various Democratic Party activities, national chairman, significant fundraiser associated with the Clintons for many, many years, and he's in his first term. My argument about the governors is the governor is got to be the toughest job in America because you have these huge entitlements issues, right? At the federal level, and also things from your predecessor, right? The old joke of whatever problem you have, blame your predecessor. In this case, it's probably true. And they also, because they don't control a central bank, they can't print money to get out of the problem, which is what national governments can do. And furthermore, they're seeing tough competition now from the other states. So they not only have an inability to print money to get out of a mess, but they also have tough competitors in adjacent markets. And there's also an unclear boundary, which we'll call states' rights or the Federal Commerce Clause and so forth and so on. So each of the four states that we're featuring today are neither fully red nor fully blue in the current sort of zeitgeist, right? They, in my view, represent microcosms of America today. And so my goal today is to sort of reflect that and talk about it. And I thought we would start by asking our two Republican friends a little bit about how, from their perspective, and I should say, by the way, the social views of Republicans are consistent with the party view, and the Democratic social views are consistent with the Democratic view. And that's not the focus of our panel today. So let's start with our two Republican governors by asking them some questions about how they approach some problems. I thought I'd ask Rick Scott to start with. You are here in California, running around in the state of which I am a resident, trying to get Californians to move to Florida because of lower costs.
Absolutely.
Why? And you're not even apologizing.
No. My job is to get jobs for Florida families. That's what I ran on. I ran on a campaign in 2010. I said 7 steps to 700,000 jobs in 7 years. And so I've done trade missions around the world. I've gone to other states. This is my second trip to California. And my whole job is to get more businesses to move to Florida so we get more Florida jobs. We've added 1,061,000 jobs in 5 years and 3 months. We have lower taxes than the rest of the country. We have we've cut 4,200 regulations. We have no income tax. Our LLCs and sub-S don't pay a business tax. Our corporate tax is only 5.5%, and 80% of our corporations don't have to pay that. We've streamlined the permitting process. And so California is almost just the opposite. And then the latest is, by passing this $15 minimum wage, the estimate is 700,000 people are going to lose their jobs. I grew up in a family that struggled for work. I lived in public housing. I watched my dad lose his job. Every job is important. Every job is important. He was a bus driver. He was a truck driver. I want all those jobs in my state. And so I'm out here. I'm going to do everything I can to get more jobs. Last year when I was here, the ports were struggling with strikes. We've invested $1 billion in our ports. We've now added 200,000 trade jobs. but we're after every type of job we can, all in our state.
Yeah, Governor Walker, you are famous nationally for one of the first acts you did when you became Wisconsin governor, which is that you attempted to end the collective bargaining rights of the public sector unions, just the public sector. And after a bruising fight, I believe these laws were actually passed. Why did you choose that one? As a political calculation, why did you choose that to be your signature issue?
Well, really, it actually ties in what Rick just talked about. It was about stability. We knew that employers in our state and those that we were trying to attract wanted stability. We inherited, as you talked about, each of us inherited challenges because of the recession. When I came in, we had a $3.6 billion budget deficit, and we had only a handful of ways of dealing with it. We could either lay off over 10,000 public employees, and even though I wanted a streamlined government, I wanted it done through a reform, not through random pink slips. We could have dramatically raised taxes, but that would have had a wet blanket effect on the state's economy that would already in challenging times. In fact, when I ran, the unemployment rate was 9.2% beginning of 2010. It's now 4.5%. And or we could do what we did. And having been a local government official, I knew that collective bargaining was not a right, it was an expensive entitlement, and that we needed to change that. We needed to take the power out of the hands of the few and put it into the many, in this case, the taxpayers. And what we did was really fundamentally pro-taxpayer, pro-worker. 5 years later, it's paid off over $5 billion in savings for the taxpayers at the state and the local level. We have more people working in our state than we've ever had in the history of our state. We've got balanced budgets in the last 5 years. And for all the things that people predicted, they said schools would be devastated. Last year's graduating class had the second highest ACT scores in the country, third highest graduation rates in the country. So obviously those reforms worked. And the stability with that, though, was you look just like Rick's here in California. For years, we've done the same thing with Illinois. One of my fastest growing counties is southeastern Wisconsin, is Kenosha. 4,000 some jobs in the last couple of years. Why? Because huge numbers of employers have come up from Chicago and said there's stability in Wisconsin, a state that has one of two states in the country with a fully funded pension system, a rainy day fund that's 165 times bigger than we took office, all these other things, lowering taxes like Rick and others are doing, versus Illinois, where they have a pension that's not even half funded. Real stability questions, and increasingly employers were looking at that. Not, in addition to our tax cuts and regulatory relief and all that, it really was about stability.
Just a quick additional follow-up. So did you know when you did the initiative that you would ultimately face a very tough recall, which you ultimately won?
No. No, politically, no one would intentionally go in and do that. What I just thought was you go in and do the right thing. You go in and make those choices. I remember going in and talking to both our Assembly and our Senate, both of our legislative chambers, our caucuses, and saying, you got to make decisions that think about the next generation, not just about the next election. Now, thankfully, the next election took care of itself. And you mentioned all four of us are from states that are really competitive states, not only in presidential elections, but gubernatorial and statewide elections as well. And in my state, I can't get elected with Republicans. I need independents and discerning Democrats. And what I found, and I think it's consistent, we each have different backgrounds and different ways of doing things, but I found that most independent voters, what they want more than anything isn't just Republican or Democrat leadership. They want people to lead. They want people to spell out what they're going to do and not back down in the face of adversity, and that's what we did. But no pundit, no political pollster would have ever told me to do what we did, but we had to be done.
So, Governor Hickenlooper, you're interesting because in addition to having a sort of a genuinely Colorado background, right, and a sort of growing up through the culture, you've adopted a different path in dealing with the problems that you faced, right? You're seen as much more of a moderate in these areas. You've in fact taken on the unions as a Democrat, right? Why is your solution working, and why is it different?
Well, certainly we all agree on jobs. I think all four of us would be ranked near the top of those lists. Colorado, I mean, we're almost equally divided between Republicans, Democrats, and unaffiliated voters. So, and we're historically a very collaborative place, right? The West got settled by wagon trains, not by, you know, the rugged individual, despite the mythology. And we have collaborated for decades. So we came in and, you know, quality of life starts with a good job. Without good jobs, you can't do anything else. We focused on reducing red tape, making sure we had better access to capital. We went around the state and did a kind of a bottom-up economic development plan for the whole state. And we were 40th, I think, in 2010 when I ran in job creation. When I ran for re-election, we were 4th. Now we're 2nd. By almost any measure, we're either 1st, 2nd, 3rd. Unemployment's down now to, from 10% down to 2.7%. But it really is by focusing on what are those things that employers need, what do they need, what do entrepreneurs need, the young people that are going to drive the new economy, the right code for the internet, are going to want to support Alphabet. They want to be, we're either us or Virginia, we've been, the DC area or Colorado have been the top couple of destinations for millennials now for the last 6 or 7 years. And that translates into high percentages of startups, lots of young companies that are trying to grow very rapidly, which is where the real job creation is. In terms of what are our policies that are different, we've really focused not on tearing anything down, but like with our workforce programs, and this is an amazing statistic, 70% of our kids in this country are never going to get a college degree. They're not going to get a junior college degree. They're not going to get that degree. So we've really thrown ourselves into that 70% and say, all right, if you want someone who's going to write code for your, the cybersecurity initiative we're working on, those kids don't need 4 years or 6 years. A lot of them just need 6 months. So we've been working with the McAuliffe Foundation, Zoe Baird, to create a website, and LinkedIn has been a partner on this, to help us make sure that we can track, what are the skills you get for every single community college class. You can click on the community college class, you see not just the curriculum, but what are the skills you're going to get. And then as you go through life, these young people can keep a living resume of everything they've accumulated. So if they learn how to do inventory at Walmart, that they get that badge, it stays with them, assuming they want it, we don't do this without their permission, obviously. But it allows them to have a living resume that follows them, and at the same time allows us to look at how do we get to these kids sooner. And we're just now beginning to work on a statewide apprenticeship program where when a kid's 17, they can go to work. And work 3 days a week, and then the 2 days where they go back to school, to community college or a workforce training center, the curriculum is defined in large part by the industry in which they're working. So it's banking or insurance, it's not just welding. And I think that's going to be one of the big challenges is how do we take this retraining notion, especially let kids have a taste of working and help define what they want their career to look like. And then it's easy to scale that to the 45 and 55 and 60-year-olds who have lost their careers and also need to be retrained. I think that this McAuliffe Foundation initiative is going to allow us to retrain people very, very rapidly. And these days, it's a talent race, right? And that those of us that have the best flow of talent coming into our pipeline, we're going to get the employers coming to us.
Governor McAuliffe, you're from my home state of Virginia, and Virginia is booming. And under your leadership, you claim to be the most traveled governor.
Internationally.
Internationally. Why are you spending so much time out of our favorite state?
Because that's where, let me be very clear, we have to go get new jobs. I don't spend my time as governor going to other states, because when you get into that game, you got to play the incentive game, and it's very expensive to do that. So unlike some other governors who've have made a history going to the States, but listen, 95% of the world's customers live where? Outside the United States of America. 81% of the growth in the globe in the next 5 years is going to come outside the United States of America. So I go where the jobs are. I just got back. I was in England last week. I was in Germany last week in Brussels. I've got 6 more trade missions coming up this year. We're bringing the jobs back. I just got back from China. I just won the largest investment ever by a Chinese company in America. I just won that in Virginia. $2 billion investment, 2,000 new jobs. That would not have happened unless I took 2 trips to China and sat with the CEO of that company face to face and negotiated. So I travel constantly to go build the economy. Virginia's in a very unique position. We're the #1 recipient of Department of Defense dollars, #1 of all 50 states. 27 military installations, the largest naval base in the world, the Pentagon, CIA, Quantico, Langley. That's great when they're spending money, but when you go through sequestration, like we went through 2 years ago, Virginia lost $9.8 billion. Direct payments, most of it to Northern Virginia, equated to the loss of about 200,000 jobs. My whole emphasis as governor has been, we got to build a new economy. We want the military assets, but we've got to bring in new jobs, cybersecurity. I have more data centers than any state in America. I have the 2nd most technology workers of any state in America. Building that new economy, and as you say, I just announced a 4% unemployment rate. Our initial unemployment claims just hit a 41-year low. But the international travel, I've announced $11.2 billion of capital investment since I've been governor. That's the most of any governor in Virginia history. You go where the economic activity is and you bring them back. And I would say it's cheaper to do it that way because I don't have to compete on incentives versus my fellow governors. We don't buy deals. You know, we're not big in the incentive game in Virginia. You got to be in the game, but if you go and do internationally, that's where the activity for the future is.
What's interesting to me is that each of these states are led by strong leaders who have different solutions that are producing significant growth. So each of you, however, has the problem that you have an eventual boss, which is the federal government, the Congress, and so forth, at least in the form of mandates that you probably don't like, especially when they force you to do things without giving you money. And in your case, you used sequestration as an example, which touched all of you. I'm worried about the health of the states in general, right? Just as a broad statement. I look at Illinois. Many people have looked at the finances of Illinois. Again, you described it, I think, quite accurately. In California, where I'm a resident and where we are here now, obviously, California was negative $60 billion when Jerry Brown in his second term ultimately solved this problem by a large, large tax increase, right, to help cover that and essentially address it. What is the state of states today, right? Ask anyone who wants to talk about this. And how do you think the various financial problems of states are going to get solved?
I can tell you what we did. I walked in with almost a $4 billion budget deficit. So we balanced the budget the first year. You don't make everybody happy when you balance the budget when you start. We started cutting taxes our first year, but what we really went after is jobs. We just went after watching how we spent every dollar. We downsized the number of state workers. I think we've gone from about 127,000 to 114,000 state workers. We went through every agency. Now the federal government is often difficult to deal with. I'll give you an example. When I first walked in, there had been a decades-old lawsuit over the Everglades, and there were 4 separate federal agencies that were suing the state. And so I said, fine, I'll go sit down with them. Well, they wouldn't. I just sit down separately with Justice, separately with Interior, separately with EPA, separately with Corps of Engineers. And it took about a year and a half, and we ended up with an $880 million 12-year agreement with regard to the flow and, well, really more the quality of water through the Everglades. But you just had to go, and the 4 of us up here are out trying to fix our states every day, but it's just, you take a problem and you say, how can I solve it? And that's why governors are having a lot of success around the country.
Are there examples, using that as an example, are there examples, I know, for example, the Obamacare mandates were highly controversial in each of your states. How do you navigate these entitlements? There's a political component, but there's a real issue of you take the money and there also comes with constraints. Can you give examples where you fought this in one form and got what you needed?
Sure. We can tie in, and I think every state's unique, so you got to look at it that way. But with Medicaid is one of the fastest growing areas in every state budget. Each state views it a little bit differently, but we've made some changes not only in Medicaid, for the first time ever, everyone in our state is covered, but we didn't take the expansion. Some states did, some states didn't under the Affordable Care Act. We were the only state that didn't take the expansion that now has no insurance gap because we were creative in terms of covering how we covered everybody living in poverty. But you look at other things like food stamps as an example. We have a requirement started a year ago. We had to fight a little bit with the federal government on this that says that if you're an adult who's able to work without children, now in the state of Wisconsin, you have to be enrolled in a job training program that we provide in order to get assistance, in order to get food stamps. Now, at the time, some people in our state capital complained saying, oh, you're making it harder to get government assistance. I said, no, we're not. We're making it easier to get a job. And we've seen about 12,000 people shift just since then to go from government assistance to what I call true independence by being free of that assistance. And our goal is to get everybody, to every single person who is, again, doesn't affect children. That's a whole different category. But for those who are adults capable of working without a child in the home, to get them the employability skills they need to get in the workforce. Because probably even more so than just the specific example, I would imagine for all 4 of us, my number one problem in my state is workforce. having more people working in the state than ever before. My biggest challenge today is not one I anticipated 6 years ago. 6 years ago, we were all talking about jobs, jobs, jobs. We're still talking about jobs. My big problem is how to fill those jobs. And so whether it's like Hick was talking about with technical college training, apprenticeships, our apprenticeships for youth are double what they were 4 years ago. Our technical programs, we've shifted all sorts of resources into our associate degree programs. But I still don't have enough workers. And so to me, anytime there's people on the sidelines, whether it's people on public assistance, whether it's returning veterans, whether it's people with physical or developmental disabilities, I want to figure out ways to get them all into the workforce, because it's not just about filling the jobs today. It's about the abundance of other employers who could fill even more, who would create even more, but they have to have the certainty that they can fill the jobs they have vacant. If we can deal with workforce issues, not just in our states, but I believe in our country, that's the key to economic growth.
Do you guys have examples where the government did something that made no sense that you have been fighting or you want to fight?
Yeah, well,
There's probably a long list.
well, the two biggest issues for us, obviously, sequestration. Let me be clear. It's been pushed off for 2 years. It's not dealt with.
It's not over?
No, it comes back in 2 years full force. So Congress...
That's crazy.
Yeah, oh yeah, they just kicked the can. Now, I'll give Speaker Ryan credit. At least it was dealt with, so as governors, we can begin to make some strategic planning. The other thing that was most frustrating for us was the transportation bill. Congress refused, they wouldn't touch the gas tax. Everybody lost their minds. So we at the state level could not, you can't build roads without a long-term plan to do it. And their inability to have sustained financing for transportation, for us in Virginia, for those who are Virginia residents, 495 and 95, I've just put more investment in transportation ever, only because finally Congress got their act together, and now we have a long-term defined payment, so we know we can now build roads. So I give Congress credit for that.
But both sequestration and the transportation issues were congressional action or inaction.
Kicked the can down the road for years and years, which really hurt our ability to grow our economies. Can't grow your economies if you can't invest in transportation. And if you're going to be cut severely by the federal government, every state has to be very careful about what they do. Those are the two big issues I've dealt with in 2 years.
Governor?
Well, I hate to miss a chance to pile on the federal government. But I think what is interesting, and we do, every state wants more flexibility. We want waivers if we can find savings in how we implement Medicaid policy. We all want that. I mean, states are the laboratories of democracy. It's the way the country was set up. And so that expectation is there, and it should be there. But we are seeing, at least, again, this is where I'll get in trouble for even remotely, let me make it clear, I'm not in any way defending the federal government. But we're seeing, when we had the Gold King spill in western Colorado on the Animas River, there was an EPA project where somebody made a terrible mistake. The EPA, for the first time in my memory, Gina McCarthy, the administrator, came and said, we're going to treat ourselves to the same high standards we'd hold any business, and they're going to go out and make whoever suffered damage, they're going to be made whole as much as possible. That's the way the federal government should operate. And we look at a lot of the oil and gas regulations we did in the West, in Colorado. We were the first state to actually sit down with the oil and gas industry and then the Environmental Defense Fund and the environmental leadership to really negotiate methane emissions, right? So we know that they are a climate change gas. We know that a lot of the large fields have huge levels of methane emissions. But you can't just wait for the federal government to come out and kind of impose a blanket system, because you know it's never going to have the same efficiency and effectiveness. So we sat down with the oil and gas leadership from Anadarko and Noble Energy and Canada, big, successful, responsible companies, but with the environmental leadership. In the first few months, they just negotiated the definitions in the research. All the research papers, what does this really mean? And then they got to where, and my commitment to them was we would make it as efficient as possible, there'd be no money wasted, and that everybody would get, be no red tape, and everyone would share credit for the success. And when we, 2.5 years ago, came out with the first set of national methane regulations, it was a win-win for everyone. And that's the way, as states do that on a different level, that's what should contribute towards a national policy, so that you actually get the granularity of really solving the problem on the ground before imposing regulation.
I want to come back to the substance of the panel, but you know this is coming. I've got to ask you about recreational marijuana. In terms of a difference between a state and laboratories of democracy, here we have a real laboratory. You are famously not too wild about this legislation, and you have recommended to your fellow governors that they wait. Tell us why.
Well, I oppose the original legislation or the constitutional initiative to make recreational marijuana legally, just because it's against federal law. You don't want to be in conflict with basic federal law. But once it passed 55-45. My job is to deliver on the will of the people of Colorado. So we've gone for the last 3 years and from scratch created a regulatory environment, which I think we're getting to the point where we can see now. I have a friend who has a day labor company that gives, if you want a ditch dug for a day, he helps you hire those people, and they come back to his place and they get paid every day. Used to always have some drug dealers around. He said for the last year he hasn't seen any drug dealers. And you think about it, you take marijuana out of the inventory of a drug dealer, you're going to have less things to sell. It makes obvious sense you're going to have less drug dealers. And drug dealers don't care who they sell to. Our biggest fear was kids would be, think it was safer to smoke pot or get high, that kids would smoke it or, eat edibles. We saw a little bit of a spike, but not a big spike. And it begins to appear, if I had a magic wand, and I said this 6 months ago, if right after the election I had a magic wand and I could have reversed that election, I would have done it. Now that we're several years into creating this regulatory framework where we really do, it's a $1 billion industry in Colorado now. They're collecting about $100 and some million in taxes, which we're putting strictly, we're not using it to backfill anything else in government. We're using it for public safety, for regulatory, for marketing to kids and to their parents about, if you're a teenager, your brain's growing rapidly, this is still a very dangerous drug, much more dangerous than young people think. Mental health issues where kids slide off the tracks, we're able to fund a lot of those programs now that we couldn't. If I had that magic wand now, I'm not sure I'd wave it. I'd want to wait a couple more years. I'm still telling other governors, I'd wait a couple years and let's see what unintended consequences might be there. But it's beginning to look like it might work.
Let's get back to workforce.
Don't look at me. I didn't bring it up. I just want that.
No. I just couldn't resist. It's California. It's a pretty liberal place.
And John's not eating any Doritos, so feel free. He's not.
No Cheetos.
That's right.
Yeah. Let's get back to workforce training. What I thought was interesting is if you go back to the 2008-2009 crisis, the states are in horrific shape. Right, it makes sense, right? Revenue falls, right? The expenses are still there, and in many cases they're worse because of the healthcare issues and the real dislocation that occurs in these horrific recession. Do you believe, and again, Governor, you mentioned that, do the rest of you believe that there's some sort of corner been turned, that the real problem is not jobs, but education, capability, suitability, all of those kinds of things, as Governor Walker mentioned? Are we there now?
I think we still have to worry about jobs. I think as a country, we still have to understand we're competing globally. I was with Jeff Immelt the other day from GE. 70% of the revenues are outside the United States. We're competing for jobs. And if we don't continue to build this country as a country for capitalism, for jobs, we're going to have a problem. Everything we're getting to do in our state is tied to the fact that we've added 1 million jobs. So I think every one of us is very focused on how do we build the workforce, whether it's our K-12 systems, our state college systems, our junior college in some states, or our universities. If we don't do that long term, we're going to fail. And all of us are trying to do different things, whether it's certificate programs, there's a variety of things, but every one of us that's had success has figured out how to measure this. In our state, 22% of our university budgets now are tied to basically 3 things. What's it cost to get a degree? Do you have a job when you finish? And how much money do you make? I'd like to try to pick, we'd all like to say, we know this is going to work, but the truth is the private workforce knows what they want. And so we're doing the same thing in our state colleges, and we're working with our high schools, and we have 48 technical schools, all focused very much on how do we get these ready for a job that's going to be at the end or a career.
Your report sounds like you're also just managing that process better, tying it to objectives and so forth. Are there any new breakout ideas that you all have heard that will produce the workforce for the next century? Is there something new or exciting that's on your desk that you're thinking about, or someone's proposed to you that you're entranced by?
Well, we just signed legislation. I just got through our session. We just finished up. I just put a new $1 billion into education, our biggest investment ever, all for workforce development. We have the first pay for performance workforce grant, first in the nation to do that. We just got that signed into law. We have a huge veterans piece. The other big issue for us in Virginia is the number of veterans we have. They come back with a tremendous amount of experience. The military's paid for them. I have about 800,000, second most fastest growing veteran population. Give them credit for the skill set they already have and move them right into the workforce. So we've really worked in defining and making sure our veterans can come right back, go right in the workforce. I have right now in Virginia 30,000 technology jobs open. 17,000 of those are cyber jobs. Starting pay, $88,000. You're all too young, but there used to be a movie called The Graduate. The key phrase was plastics. I will tell you today it's cyber. It is the one area that the federal government is going to spend billions and billions of dollars. So we're transforming our high schools. High schools don't work anymore. Yeah. They are buildings with classroom, with seats. And you get credit for seat time. We're totally transforming our high schools. Core courses earlier, go out in your junior, senior year, industry credentials while you're still in high school, so you got a skill set when you actually come out.
What are some
and
other ideas?
when you made the point though about the change, I would just qualify it. It went from just solely creating jobs to filling the workforce. It's not an either or. I find just about every day, certainly every week when I go out and talk to employers, and it's not just in manufacturing. Manufacturing is a given, at least in our state, whether it's highly skilled welding, machining, fabricating, but also engineering jobs. But it's in IT, it's in healthcare, it's in transportation, construction, but I even find in finance and accounting, huge vacancies out there. And what happens is it's a workforce and career development issue for sure, but then it becomes an economic development issue. Because many of those same employers say not only can they have a need to fill positions, but they'll then say there's enough work out there, and some of the ways, Terry, you were talking about globally, taking on new markets, new places out there. Listen, we can take on even more work, but we can't take it on until we have the certainty of knowing the jobs we have vacant today can be filled. If you're a manufacturer and you've got 5 highly skilled welding positions, which highly skilled welding positions can pay $75,000 to $80,000 a year or more if you're working a little overtime. A lot of times people tell me they have those positions open, but they could create 3 or 4 times that many if they had confidence. So we started, similar to what you've heard from the others, we started funding in our schools and as early as 6th grade academic and career plans, much like they do in Europe and Germany and elsewhere, to get young people thinking about it sooner. Start doing what we call, others call it similar things, dual enrollment or course options, where students get credit in junior high and high school so that they get a head start on getting into the workforce. It also helps with student loan debt, because if you can take a year or semester off of those costs, it's tremendously important. But getting young people to start thinking about their careers early on, because so many of the professions that are needed don't require traditional 4-year undergraduate or even graduate level degrees. Many do, but many others require an associate degree or an apprenticeship or some sort of customized work or training. We're certainly doing it in Wisconsin. I think a number of other successful states are doing the same thing, because we can't just rely on the traditional graduate from high school, go on to college, everybody do the same thing, because that's just not working. We got to find other ways of filling those spots. When we do it, that opens the door for more jobs and more investment.
I wanted to ask Governor Scott in Florida. Florida has still a large transportation set of needs because of the structure of the state and so forth. This has been on your list for a long time. Do you have the same frustration that Governor McAuliffe has with respect to the transportation stuff at the federal level? Do you have other mechanisms by which you've been able to address transportation needs in this very diverse state?
So as an example, we have 15 seaports interstate, big opportunity with the expansion of the Panama Canal. The strikes on the West Coast with the ports create a big opportunity for Florida. The federal government is not putting money into ports. So we have funded their portion. So like when I came in, the Miami port needed to be finished the dredge to 50 feet. It took we had the state portion up. The feds were supposed to put up the last $78 million of their match. They never put it up. So we had to go and get Congress to even allow us to put up the money, but we put up the money. We put up the money for Jacksonville. We put up the money for other ports. And so, that's where our biggest frustration. But we're spending this year $10.8 billion in transportation. We're spending about $200 million a year in our ports. But we on our highway system, in our airports, because everything in Florida right now is growing really rapidly. But fortunately, our revenues are also growing very rapidly. But if we wait for the feds, the Miami Port project by itself, finished with the tunnel, is 33,000 jobs by itself. I ran on a campaign of 700,000 jobs, so I walked in. That's 5% of what I needed. And so we immediately tried to figure out how we can do that.
It's interesting that, Governor, you actually, among your many travels, went to Cuba, I understand, and Cuba's literally next door. Where are you guys on opening up Cuba? The president, of course, has indicated a path opening up. We've reestablished an embassy. This is a highly political issue in Florida. It's clear to me, and to show you my bias, that opening up Cuba would benefit Cuba and America in a very big way. We Google Alphabet are prevented by law from establishing essentially any significant business operations in Cuba today.
Well, it'd be great if Cuba was going to be open, but you can see nothing's going to change while the Castro brothers are still in power. So while they're in power, I personally believe we continue the embargo to continue to put pressure on them to believe in to help democracy, political freedom. They're still arresting innocent protesters. The ladies in white still believe that the only way we're going to see democracy if we continue the embargo. So I think we're not going to see much change until we see the Castro brothers gone.
Governor?
Yeah, I take a different take. I'm all for ending the embargo. I make the point that we lost 57,000 Americans in Vietnam, and we've had an embassy and full trading relations for about 25 years now. This is a country of 11 million people, 90 miles off our coast. I just signed a strategic partnership between the Port of Mariel and our port at Norfolk. We right now have the deepest port on the East Coast, and those Panama ships are coming around in June, maybe a little stop by in Florida on their way up to Virginia. Would be a good thing, but a huge opportunity for us on the port. But I just got back from my second trip down there, and I'm proud to say of the two trips I am now, Virginia's the #1 exporter now in the country to Cuba. What does that mean? That means a lot of jobs in Virginia for our farmers. So I've signed strategic deals, and it's worked. I'm creating a lot of jobs because of that partnership, and I want to continue to grow it. And listen, people say, well, you got issues, and I don't support what the Castro brothers do, but if you took that to its natural conclusion, you shouldn't allow me to be doing business in China either.
So, for the benefit of the audience, America has kept Cuba alive for about 40 years with a food aid program of $400 million or more. It's a very, very generous act by America, and it's been central to the health and literally life of the Cubans during the Castro regime. I thought we could finish and then move to audience questions in a minute. And I wanted to talk a little bit about trade, free trade, jobs. And I want to we're getting a little closer to sort of the political dynamics that are going on in the country. Many people in this audience, I suspect, are free traders, right? For economic, everyone here is, a lot of business people here, so forth and so on. The country is not necessarily in agreement with the majority of people in this room over these questions. TPP, which has been negotiated for years, is now going to go through a brutal confirmation or whatever it is process in the Senate, and is highly unlikely to survive in current form by the time it's done. If it gets, it'll be changed materially because of the politics and so forth. So it seems like the country lost some image of international trading and so forth as a result of the tremendous and very deep dislocations that have gone on in the country. How has that manifested in your leadership as governors, right? How does it actually change the way you behave? Does this come up? Do people start yelling at you? How does it actually feel, right? You're the guy literally there that they can come and demonstrate in front of and so forth. How does it play out? Governor, go ahead.
So it's one of those conundrums. It's kind of hard to understand politically just because now you see a number of Republicans against the TPP and many trade agreements, in addition to the traditional opponents on the Democratic side. And I understand the opposition on both sides, but I've been fairly consistent on recognizing that long-term commerce creates wealth, it creates jobs. It doesn't mean we shouldn't, within those agreements, make sure we don't allow all kinds of unsavory conditions in the workplaces, in the factories abroad that are supplying goods and trading with us. But at a certain point, you've got to recognize that the trade it's a rising tide that raises all boats. And I've, again, trying to balance those two important, kind of foundational attitudes has been very difficult. And I've talked to Republicans in our congressional delegation who really have trouble with some of the trade agreements. I've talked to, anyone who will listen, just saying, long term, we can iron out the problems and make these things work. And I think, ultimately, what we're seeing with both parties, and I mean, we see it in the presidential elections, that there's a lot of people in this country right now that lost their careers or are deeply unhappy, haven't had a raise in years, and they're frustrated by their own situation. And I think a lot of that frustration is being taken out on, things like increasing trade.
Governor, same view, different view.
Same view. I've been very strong. I'm a big free trader. As long as the rules are written to the point that we can compete, I will compete against anybody, as long as they're fair. So as soon as they came out on TTIP and TPP, I mean, I did a press conference with Ambassador Froman and Secretary Pritzker. I mean, I got out very early to do it. They wanted a Southern Democrat to get out there. There's only 2 of us left. we're a small breed of governors in the South, the Democrats. But my whole point is, listen, a lot of, I used to be chairman of the Democratic National Committee. I got a lot of great friends in labor and so forth. But at the end of the day, you got to grow your economy. Trade is a huge piece of Virginia. And as long as it's fair, and I rely on Ambassador Froman. He does this for a living. These are so complex. If they can assure me, and if we don't do TPP, let me be very clear. China will write the rules for Asia on trade. And that is the last thing any of us want. But give me a fair deal, I'll compete, we'll beat them.
The reason I'm asking is that 10 years ago, I think most people that I dealt with would say, we're free traders as long as the other side respects human rights, humanitarian, those sorts of things. My sense, sort of as a citizen, is that something has changed because of the extraordinary dislocation in the country, that people are now angry, and it's not really about the other people's quality of life, it's the fact that I don't have a job, and that's become the framing.
Yeah, but it hasn't been
Governor?
sold. I mean, part of it is, I think, a lot of people, from our state, we believe in trade. Many people think we're the capital of Latin America. I mean, we have so many people coming from South America and Central America coming to Florida. But I think everybody also expects it to be fair. And I think one thing we have to do is we have to go explain the terms of these agreements and why they're fair to Americans.
So just to make sure, I'm just trying to make sure I understand. You agree with
I believe in
governors.
I believe
you
in trade.
clearly.
Oh, yeah.
Why do Americans not agree with you at this level?
Well, I think people don't understand the terms of the deal. I think people have been dislocated in our society over jobs going overseas. And so I think we have to explain how we're going to create more jobs by doing these things.
Governor, your thoughts?
I'm taking the red eye tonight to be home tomorrow because I've got a big delegation coming in from Germany, from Hessen, our sister state, but to talk about trade. I haven't traveled quite as much as Terry, but I've been to the UK and all over Europe, and next month I'll be in Mexico, been in Canada and China and Japan and all those different places. Often, though, I just talked to a different country about a month ago, and they were asking about this very issue, looking at, think about it politically, and I'm not going to get into politics, but where do Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump align? It's on trade.
It's on trade, right?
And for largely some of the same reasons. You've had a couple of references to this. Displacement, people are frustrated. They're looking for things to blame. This is one of them they blame on. I think it's misguided. I think there's legitimate concern about both the displacement of job and the lowering of wages. But I would argue that trade has the opposite effect, that if you aggressively push trade, it will increase the opportunities for those people to be employed and will actually raise wages. Because Terry, you're exactly right. American workers can compete with anybody in the world if we compete on a level playing field. Part of the challenge has been, and it goes back to our instinctive frustration with Washington and a lot of other issues, is when you talk about these trade agreements, and it's not just this administration, it's with Bush, it's with Obama, it's with Congress in general, they're so complicated. The principle of trade is pretty simple. Level the playing field, let us compete. Our workers can compete with anything. The more complicated it gets, the more suspect people get, the more they think certain things are happening. But if you think about the logic of this, I saw a reference to saying, trade deals with countries that have lower wages, of course they're going to be bad. Well, we already have countries out there that have lower wages that don't have trade agreements with us out there that are competing for those jobs. Why not give our workers a chance to get in those markets where we can add value, not just in terms of the wages we pay our employees, but in terms of the quality, the innovation, all the other things we bring to the table. We need to make that case. We need to point out that if you want to compete, over 90% of the world's purchasing power is outside of our country, and why would we not let our workers compete for some of those jobs and some of those opportunities? That's the case that needs to be made with trade. It is interesting, though, not just with this panel, but when I point this out to observers from around the world, where there might be, as Hick talked about, on the right and the left in Congress, real friction out there on some of these trade agreements. Amongst governors, we're all about trade. I don't think there's a one of us out there that isn't out hustling around the world to try and bring trade in.
Interesting how much agreement there is among our four governors. Time for you all to ask questions. Anything goes. Who would like to ask the first question? Right here. Yes, sir.
Puerto Rico had a $470 million payment to be made today, which Governor Padilla says they're not going to make. Rick, you're the closest governor to Puerto Rico. Do we have should we require federal oversight of Puerto Rico? And do we owe a responsibility to the citizens?
I think it's pretty difficult to figure out what to do with Puerto Rico. Actually, what's happening in Florida is we have, Puerto Ricans are American citizens, and so they are coming primarily going to Orlando and then Tampa and then to South Florida, but they're coming to Florida because we have job openings and we have jobs. It's very difficult to figure out exactly what to do there and what their population wants. But it's the way it's spilling over is so many Puerto Ricans are moving. I'm sure they're moving to other states, but they are coming. There's significant amounts coming to, especially the Orlando area.
Let's get some questions in the back.
So they hang out here and then
Where were we?
somebody
Where's
doesn't
the mic?
show up
Yeah.
and they go.
Right there. Go ahead. Yes, go ahead.
I know there's a lot of focus on workforce training and getting jobs. One of the key drivers of the absenteeism of productivity and workforce is care. Not having enough child care, senior care. What are each of you doing to actually address care in your states?
Yeah, let's have one governor answer to be in the spirit of
So
rapidity.
we are, especially elder care is a big deal, and it does tie in at all ages, right? Everyone thinks that for like child care, it's just one thin demographic. And I think this reflects back to our whole discussion about trade. A big part of that is our inability to retrain people in their 40s and 50s to, when they've lost their whole career, how do they get a new career? And we've got to be a lot faster at retraining people. This website the Markle Foundation is helping us put together, it's called Skillful. I think the whole program, we're going to call it My Shot, but it is going to train. There is such a deficit of elder caregivers and even child caregivers, early childhood education educators, that we have to do everything we can to rapidly accelerate the training that we're doing and not spend 4 years training, giving someone training where they only really need 6 or 9 months. We've got to get a lot more efficient, and I think that requires technology, but it also needs disruptive thinking on the whole system.
Well, one quick thing on this, because we've all got examples of this, but one interesting one. A lot of people don't know this, at least in our state. I believe it's similar in other states. About 60% of the caregivers for people with dementia and Alzheimer's are in the workforce, not as caregivers. So we created, amongst other things we do for childcare and things like that, but specifically we just recently rolled out a program targeted towards employers that's dementia-friendly for their employees to help them understand ways to help their employees with the time they need, the care with doctor's visits, things like that. Not mandated, but help giving them the tools to be able to do that and to identify employees. Because particularly for people who have loved ones with dementia and Alzheimer's, often they hide that. It's not like other issues where like childcare, you're more likely to go to your employer and say, I need some help. A lot of times, particularly for a spouse, they're hiding that because it's not just their spouse, it's them that are dealing with the challenge of that. And so that's something new and unique. We're just starting in Wisconsin.
Yes, ma'am, over here. Can we get the mic up? And then we'll go over here somewhere. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. So last year here at Milken, Sheryl Sandberg asked the three Treasury Secretaries, Geithner, Rubin, and Paulson, about closing the gender gap of economic participation for women and cited Warren Buffett on how much that would add to GDP. None of them really were able to answer the question very well. They asked her to answer it. But back to you all, what would, in terms of closing, labor force participation of women is now declining for the first time in many, many years. So given how focused you are on jobs, are you thinking about the gender implications for that and how to make sure you've got women fully participating in the workforce?
Well, I can say one thing we just did in Virginia, we kicked off and I funded in the budget. Women are a majority of the workforce. And yet, let's just take engineers, STEM H degrees, they're about 21% of those getting STEM H degrees, which you can do the graph yourself. That is a huge, huge problem because these are the jobs of the future. So we have just done a whole scholarship program to encourage more women and to help provide funding resources so that we can get more women into that STEM H career. But it's a critical problem for us today, especially as I talked about earlier, all the high-tech jobs I have open today, the cyber jobs. we need more women going into those STEM age curriculums. So we've just done a whole program to encourage women. But it's in the low 20s, and yet they're the majority of the workforce.
Can we get some questions over here? Yes, ma'am. Right here. Take the mic.
Hi. There's so much violence in the streets of the cities of your states, and that's the work that I'm in. I run a nonprofit at the UN that deals with kids at risk. How are you guys? I know that the education is important. We have to do STEM education for the kids who live in urban America so that they can have a knowledge job. How are each of you dealing with the violence and the reduction of violence around the country?
Governor Hickenlooper, you had a whole initiative around this. You want to talk about this?
Sure, and there's a number of different facets on this, but we are going through a social transformation, and we have many more single parents, we have many more just different communities, and we've got to aggressively address some of the causes of where that violence comes and the trauma that a lot of these young kids come up through influences them for the rest of their lives. So pushing forward on making sure that we look at strengthening the education system and the family, but also changing the way we prosecute cases, and that we work much more rapidly, not just to send kids to jail, but to reach out and engage them and begin to figure out ways that they can get to that first job and recognize that they've got a future.
Governor Scott?
So we're at a 44.5-year low in our crime rate in our state. But what we're doing on top of making significant progress by getting everybody to work together, on our juvenile justice program, we went to a civil citation program. So if you've not committed a violent crime, you're not going to be arrested. We've seen a 20% drop in arrests in the last, I think it's 5 years. In our prison population, we put a lot of effort into reentry programs. And so we're seeing a significant reduction in our recidivism rates. But we're taking especially and your chance of getting arrested now at all under 18 has dramatically dropped in our state. So we're having an impact on our juveniles, but on top of that, when you get out of prison, we're trying to have a dramatic impact on making sure you get back in the workforce and become a solid citizen.
There's some questions in the back.
Yes,
yes, Governor.
Because Virginia just passed a historic gun safety deal, first one in 25 years. And remember, I'm the home of the NRA. They're based in Virginia. They're very active politically. But we got all the stakeholders together in a room. I've been passionate about closing the gun show loophole. It's something I ran on. I'm a gun owner. I own 3 guns. I hunt. I take my boys hunting. I love it. I think everybody ought to go through a background check. So we were able to pass in Virginia. Right now, the only one who can do background checks is if you have a federal license. But I have thousands of non-federally licensed. We have gun shows, and as you know, many of our guns go up to New York, and that's why so many people have been active in this. We now have state police. Everyone who now goes to a gun show, you can now do a background check. We just signed that legislation, and I just passed and signed the strongest protective order in America. If you have a protective order against you, which is where many of these killings are coming from, you have 24 hours to hand over your gun, and if you do not, you have a Class 6, 5 years felony, 5 years in prison, and you lose your gun rights for the rest of your life. Now, it was a negotiation, and if Virginia can do it, a lot of these other states can do it.
One other quick thing on that. Hick mentioned the phrase trauma. And I think that's really important to the heart of what you're asking about, because later in the stage, we're talking about incarceration and even hands-on firearms, all those, we've already started to fail when it gets to that point. My wife started something in our state, it's probably similar to other programs elsewhere, called Fostering Futures about 5 years ago. They're involved now with all of our state agencies, working to try and get all 424 school districts and working with our nonprofits to train in what you probably are aware of, trauma-informed care. For people unaware, give a good example. Teaching in a school, for example, a teacher who's dealing with a disruptive student, not just to ask what's wrong with you, but what happened to you. Because by that little change in approach, you can get to the heart, because more often than not, some of the disruptive students who then lead to other problems in life, something happened to them. There's a trigger, some trauma, there was a crime, there was sexual assault, there was a domestic violence, there was child abuse, something happened. If you can treat that, then the chances are that person stops that trend and they don't proceed. If you don't, it's going to just escalate, and so many of the people that were abused or crimes committed against will repeat that cycle over again because of the trauma. Treating that trauma up front very cost effective, very rational. It stops that trend going all the way through. And I think that's something we're not only doing, it has to be done across the country.
Let's get a couple of quick more questions. Are there any more in the back before we come back up to the front? Yes, go ahead. Yes, sir. Right over here.
A Harvard study just came out that showed that more than 50% of millennials were rejecting capitalism. I think my gut feeling is that's happening because they're confusing big banks and Wall Street and a rigged economy with entrepreneurial capitalism. What are any of you doing to reverse this trend? And again, we can all see in the Bernie Sanders rallies and so forth, and there are the millennials. Well, what can you do in each of your states to reverse this thought pattern?
Number one, create good paying jobs so that there is a pipeline when these folks get out of school. Let's be honest, for too many of our students are getting out of college or other technical schools that they have a lot of debt and they don't have a job. That breeds frustration. And listen, Senator Sanders promised everybody free education. If I were a young person today, I'd say that's great. No offense to Senator Sanders. I think every governor up here would like to say we'd give free education too, but you can't afford it. So I would say the best thing you can do is provide which all of us are working on, good paying, quality jobs. And when people get out, they can go in to do that. And, it's easy to attack banks and, the rhetoric that you have in a lot of different campaigns. I would always like to say, if you want to get rid of all the banks, what are you going to replace them with? And I still haven't had a good answer to that.
Let's have our final question over here. Yes, ma'am. And we'll actually do two. Yes, ma'am, and then we'll have you have the last question, but if you make it quick, please.
I've heard a lot about job training, and no one has mentioned the 17 federal agencies that are involved with federal job training, the programs. Are there other areas? First of all, are the federal programs in this area not very effective? And secondly, are there other things the federal government should leave to you guys and get out of?
Everything.
Most everything.
Seriously. I mean, if you looked, I don't know if they'll all agree on this, but workforce development is a good example of that. They're really good at creating jobs for people who run those programs, but not often for the people who need them. And so I'd say give a block grant back to the states. Give us the full amount. We work with regions and municipalities and others. We have to be accountable for how those resources are used. But I do it in Medicaid. I do it in environmental protection. I mean, honestly, and a lot of the people who wrote this stuff lived in Terry's Commonwealth, but you think back to the founders who wrote the Constitution and the Declaration before that, they really envisioned a government that was very narrow in Washington and that was inherent. In fact, they felt so strongly about it, they added 10 more amendments, of which they clearly spelled out in the 10th that those rights not defined in the Constitution were inherently those of the states and of the people. And I think today, much like the question on capitalism, that may sound old school until you realize it's more effective, more efficient, more accountable at the local level. Where would you rather have your dollar spent? I'd rather send my dollar back to my kid's school, my public school in my neighborhood, than sending it to Washington. I'd rather have workforce development handled at the local level and the state level than out in Washington. I'd rather have transportation dealt with where they can fix my local pothole, not out in Washington. I think there's very few examples other than maybe Social Security, Medicaid and Medicare, and national defense where the states couldn't do a better job.
Let's have our last question be yes, sir. Why don't you ask, and you have the honor of the last question.
Thank you so much, John. Thanks for a great presentation. It's been very, very informative. This is a question for Florida's Governor Rick Scott in his effort to get folks to move from California to Florida based on the flyers he's passed out. If I'm a public servant, let's say a teacher, a firefighter, or even a cop, why would I put my life on the line in Florida while getting less money, lower pension benefits, and less labor bargaining protection, but my life still remains at risk? I know that I appreciate the beaches in Florida, but the beaches in California are equally as well.
Well, so in our state, as I said, we're at a 44.5-year low in our crime rate. We've got great police, fire, first responders. We just passed legislation this year to increase the survivor benefits, to make sure that the spouses, because I've been to every law enforcement funeral in our state. We've lost a little over 20 since I got elected in 2010, and it's devastating to these families and to these communities. And so we've increased the spousal benefits, the benefits for their children, and our goal is to make it the state where you want to be there and you want to be, because we care about you and we're going to take care of you.
I think everybody in this room can admire each of these people. Their commitment to their states and to serve us as citizens is best been shown today. Thank you guys so much. Let's have a huge round of applause for all of them. Okay, all of them. Okay, good. Thank you. All right.